they're just becoming so embedded. They're just another operational tool. And I think they're being used to save manpower, money, and to protect in any instant where it's dangerous to send a human being.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 183. What's the outlook for drones in crisis response situations? For that question, we turn to Emily Hough, editor-in-chief of Crisis Response Journal. Emily launched the Crisis Response Journal 15 years ago, and it has become a global information resource that covers all aspects of human-induced natural disasters, spanning response, disaster risk reduction, resilience, business continuity, and security. She works both in print and online, specializing in international publishing, events, and conferences, mainly in the fields of disaster and crisis management. Emily has founded and organized conferences and seminars in the resilience and response field, identifying global trends and anticipating future hazard scenarios. She has chaired, spoken at, moderated, and helped to curate numerous international events. She is also a media partner with the All Party Parliamentary Group on Explosive Threats at the House of Lords, and sits on the International Disaster Response Expo Advisory Panel. Emily is also a director with the consulting firm Crisis Management Ltd. Before launching the Crisis Response Journal, she worked in publishing and conferences within the fire and rescue sector, reporting on fire services and humanitarian activities from around the world, including military operations in Bosnia and Kosovo. She also worked in settlements and squatter camps in South Africa, firefighting training in Peru and Argentina, and numerous other countries. In this edition of the Drone Radio Show, Emily talks about how the use of drones has grown in the crisis response field. But before we hear from Emily, I want to thank those of you who have been supporting my funding campaign. For as little as $1, you can help defray the cost of production and keep the podcast going and growing. Go to droneradioshow.com/donate or patreon.com/droneradioshow to make a donation. Now let's hear how drones have grown in their use in the crisis response field with Emily Hough of Crisis Response Journal. Let's pick up the interview where I ask Emily to introduce herself.
So my name's Emily Hough. I'm editor-in-chief of the Crisis Response Journal, and I founded it in 2004.
Emily, what is the Crisis Response Journal?
It's a publication that deals with all aspects of prevention, preparation, mitigation, response, and reconstruction after any sort of disaster or crisis, whether it's natural or man-made. And that includes business continuity. It's everything from earthquakes to conflict to reputational management after a major PR disaster or some incident within a company or a large-scale industry. And we're a Venn diagram. So the area where all responders or anyone to do with any sort of crisis response intersects, that's the area that we're interested in. We're trying to get people to share their ideas, share their experience, and understand how the other disciplines work as well, because they don't always understand how the other disciplines work, and that can lead to problems in response.
Is your background in crisis management?
My background actually has always been in journalism and reporting. I started out working for a couple of publications in the UK on the fire and rescue services. And on the international side, that was the area that really interested me because I got to see the world. I got to see the work that fire and rescue services were doing in all sorts of scenarios, whether it was in fire prevention in squatter camps in Johannesburg or Lima, whether it was in war zones like Bosnia and Kosovo, what they were doing, and then also within communities anywhere else in the world.
Why did you start the magazine?
I also worked on a publication called Disaster Management. And it was a peer-reviewed publication, and I believe it was the first one in its field. And that really captured my imagination because although I did most of my work with the fire and rescue services, and they were wonderful, there didn't seem to be much engagement with other disciplines, whereas on the emergency side, and it was very nascent when I started working on it because people didn't really think of disasters. They were always thought of in terms of, well, the police will deal with that, the fire service will deal with that. And it wasn't really an area or a discipline. So I took that and I wanted to evolve it, but more from the frontline response perspective. Over the years, it's evolved. We initially launched just for getting the frontline responders to talk. But as the military came on board, as the UN came on board, as all these institutions, we just saw how wide it could become.
Can you tell us about the people that read the magazine?
It's going to be anyone with an interest in responding to a crisis. So we're read by frontline emergency responders, so fire, police, EMS, medical establishments, training establishments, the military, non-governmental organisations and humanitarian organisations, institutions such as the European Union, NATO, the United Nations, anyone who wants to engage with other responders before a crisis occurs.
What type of crisis response situations does the journal cover? We
deal with everything, but I always like to look at consequences and draw the dots. So if it's the chaos theory, really, if a seemingly tiny incident, say it's climate related, and one particular community somewhere has no water, the knock-on effects further down the line could become a far bigger crisis in a completely different country. When I launched the Crisis Response Journal, one of the first things we looked at was climate change. I rang around all my contacts, mostly from the fire and rescue services at the time, and said, hey, we're doing this. How do you think in 5 or 10 years' time climate change will affect your role? And to a person, and these are very clever people, very good at their jobs, they all said, what on earth would climate change have to do with us? And I was sort of like, well, floods maybe, storms, ice. And you can see how these things grow. It's about having that vision and standing back and looking at what the possible consequences could be. My main thing is, if somebody reads something in our pages that initially might interest them, but it has nothing to do with them, and they get that light bulb moment where they think, hang on, this can apply to me, even though I'm in a completely unrelated discipline, then we've done our jobs properly.
When did you start seeing drones popping up in crisis response situations?
Well, people started coming to us and saying, hey, we've got a drone. Look, we're doing this. This is great. And at first, I found it fascinating, again, going through and reviewing everything that we've published on drones, whether in our blogs or in our articles and so forth. At the very beginning, and this is many years ago now, it was, hey, we've got a drone. And then it slowly evolved into the drones are tools. It's the applications that are the really interesting side. And now we're getting articles saying, hey, we're doing this. We're doing 3D modeling of virtual catastrophe scenarios and turning them into virtual reality training for our responders. And the drones are just a tool within that, which I find has been quite amazing how much they've just become embedded within crisis response.
How widespread are they?
Anything to do with technology or research or new projects, especially within the European Commission and the European Union, there is always a drone element as far as I can see. They're just embedded. They're just ubiquitous now.
How are they being used?
I don't know where to start with this one. I was looking through yesterday, and without going into it, they're used by police, they're used by firefighters, they're used by emergency medical services, they're used in humanitarian contexts, public safety agencies, they're used for search and rescue. They can deliver medical devices or lab samples, especially in hard-to-reach areas or post-disaster areas. So this can be for health issues such as HIV prevention in Malawi, by getting lab test results far quicker because the roads are so bad. They can be used for identifying suspect packages in counter-terrorism, in chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear incidents. Emergency medical response are used after earthquakes, or they can help map areas that are vulnerable before earthquakes, during wildfires, during floods. I mean, I think any crisis situation, there's a drone there, and that's helping the people who are responding.
That's a long list. Does the magazine include case studies of how drones were specifically used in various operations?
Sometimes they do. It depends on what the article is about, because I think we've moved on a bit. And although we run a lot of articles on projects where drones are used, the actual basics of how to use it, we're getting more into the onboard equipment and the streaming capabilities and how it's all about the data and how the data is used. So we have run articles from associations and training, people who provide training for emergency and crisis response providers into the basics of using drones, but where we tend to look at the applications and how they're used now.
Considering your history in crisis response coverage, where do you think drones fit in best?
I think they're fast becoming, and I don't want to sound like I'm a complete drone fan, but I am, but I can also see there are areas and challenges that need to be addressed. As I said, they're just becoming so embedded. They're just another operational tool. And I think they're being used to save manpower, money, and to protect in any instant where it's dangerous to send a human being in.
Where do you think drones fall in comparison to other tools used by first responders?
I think, and I'm reluctant to use the term, but they are a bit of a game changer, because I was talking to a search and rescuer from Iceland. The European Emergency Number Association, ENA, organised an event earlier this year in Ljubljana in Slovenia. They showed some videos of actual rescues and how it had transformed the search and rescue field. And I was talking to one of the rescuers involved afterwards, and he was saying it's just transformed how they can search for people, because a lot of people visit Iceland as tourists and hikers and so forth. A lot of people get into trouble, and they can conduct searches in areas that humans can't actually reach, which sometimes they manage to get themselves trapped in, but rescuers find it very difficult to, in conditions that aren't always, you can't always fly a helicopter, which is going to be very expensive. You've got limited pilot hours. You've got to take all these things into consideration. How far they've changed. He was saying they didn't have drones after the Eyjafjallajökull volcanic explosion in 2010. But drones would have really, really helped in that, because you can search such vast areas and so much more efficiently.
What are some of the challenges of using drones in crisis response?
Well, I think there are quite a few. I mean, I think the first one is responsible use. And this isn't necessarily drones in crisis response, but we all know that pilots don't really like drones. And some drone operators, the majority are completely responsible people, but there can be one idiot that just goes and flies a drone somewhere they shouldn't be. And we had a report today of a near miss. I think they called it the closest near miss, with a Virgin airliner over London airspace that could have caused hundreds of deaths. So taking that aside, so we have to have a legislative and regulatory environment. And there's privacy concerns. It's the way drones are perceived, because they can be seen as negative and scary. And I know that for myself. I was on holiday in France recently. We're all in a private villa somewhere with a nice pool, and we hear a buzzing, and there's a drone flying directly above us for 30 minutes. You don't know who that is. You don't know what they're looking at. It was probably just a local estate agent, but it taps into that deep fear. And some of this is about the way people are informed about what the drone is doing. And this is especially true in law enforcement. If you tell people how the drone is being used for their safety, then you've got to win over those perceptions. And there are elements of trust which are different in different countries. You have to have trust in the authorities that are using these drones, and sometimes that's not always the case.
You know, it's interesting that even though we have a strong awareness of drones and their use cases, we can still get a little freaked out when one comes upon us.
And they sound like big hornets, which was the other problem I had, because this area of France was very renowned for hornets. I'm thinking, is that a hornet attack? I mean, that's just a bit of levity, but it's the psychological aspect, because drones they're getting smaller and smaller when you think about some of the really tiny ones, which have wonderful applications in terms of, going into collapsed buildings and identifying survivors, or being used in the Fukushima reactor in the decommissioning process and so forth. But there is that human gulp of what the hell is that as well.
In Europe, are some countries more progressive than others in their use of drones in crisis response?
Well, I think Ireland's very good. I know that because they've been working on a project with ENA, who I mentioned earlier, with DJI. Iceland, absolutely really at the forefront. And I spoke to one of the biggest proponents of drones in the country, and he was really very convincing about all the benefits and so forth. I think the UK, of course, we've fast fire and rescue services. There was West Midlands, I think, or one of the fire and rescue services has had a drone since 2007. So I think they're fairly well adopted. It's just sometimes there are problems, as you alluded to earlier, with the training, the compliance, and understanding the uses, and that can be a barrier to government and local authority or municipal uses within emergency response.
What do you think we've learned in the past couple of years?
That's a near endless question, and I could probably talk for hours about it. It's how that they can actually improve human conditions and they can make human lives better. I was talking to Romeo Durscher of DJI, again at this event, and he was telling me how they had been working and helping out with mapping after the fires in California last October. And he brought the human element through very strongly for me, because he said there was a queue of people waiting for information. They had been evacuated from their homes. They had no idea whether everything had been destroyed or whether their homes were still standing. And thanks to the 3D mapping, they could provide that information by drones. They could provide that information very quickly. And these people, even if their houses have been destroyed, it's better to know than not to know, because then you can face the future and start to rebuild your life. And we mustn't forget the human element of what this data can provide and what it means to people.
What do you think crisis response managers should consider before adding drones to their toolbox?
It might sound like the most basic advice possible, but go and talk to other organizations that have already implemented them, preferably within your field, or read as many case studies as you can. And I'm going to, obviously Crisis Response Journal publishes lots, but there's even more out there. Sometimes the information can almost be overwhelming. They have to learn from other people. I think if you go in it cold and just say, we're going to get a drone, they'll unpack it and say, now what do we do? So it's learning from other people and their experiences and what worked well for them and what didn't work well for them.
Do you feel that the technology is easy enough for the average crisis responder to use?
Crisis responders are pretty well adept at technology anyway. They have to use a lot of equipment and so forth. I think any difficulties would be very much the same difficulties a normal person would have. I've got my own story. 5 years ago, my daughter bought a drone. She'd been so excited about it. And we did the usual. We took it to the park. We flew it a bit. We crashed it loads. She finally got the hang of it. She was going to put her GoPro onto it to try to get some aerial photography. She thought she'd have one last fly, flew it. It landed some distance from us. So as we were walking over, this great big dog appeared out of nowhere and ate it. And that was my own personal experience. So I think we're always going to have, it takes some getting used to, but it's nothing. Emergency responders and crisis response experts and so forth are well versed in technology. It's all about practice.
Having covered the crisis response field for so many years, what stands out to you most?
That's a good question. I sometimes get frustrated because Crisis Response Journal is now in its 14th, 15th year, I think. And you see the same disasters and mistakes occurring every time. You see the same failures in response. And that's depressing because it shows that we're not very good at learning lessons. A lot of the time you see people suffering needlessly through a very, very simple action that could have been taken further back down the line. And that frustrates me. On the positive side, it's incredible how, as a discipline, it's gathered force and everybody is so much keener to learn and it's become more accepted. People are doing more research. Frontline responders are also academics, and it's all blurring together in a good way that practitioners know what they're talking about and how they're sharing it. And I think my biggest thing is we can talk about terrorism, we can talk about fires, we can talk about technological disasters. And I hate to say it, but at the root of all of this for the future, it's going to be climate that defines us.
Obviously, the climate change debate is huge. What do you readers say about it?
Well, the direct impacts are becoming very obvious. I think we're not quite aware of the indirect impacts when some areas, and I don't want to sound like a complete doom monger, but you do end up sounding a bit like this sometimes working in my job. Some of the more indirect consequences that we're going to have to mitigate is, do we have to look at retreat? Are there some areas of the world that are going to become uninhabitable? Whether they become too hot, they can't sustain agriculture, whether they become completely flooded and underwater, or whether they just become so extreme in terms of weather. Are we going to have to look at people moving elsewhere, and how are we going to accommodate those people? And that's quite scary.
Have you come across any discussions or ideas about how drones can be used in the climate change debate?
Oh, that's a really good one. I think there's a lot of mapping and monitoring and all those sort of things that have been going on for a long time in terms of climate change. and prevention. And one of the way drones are helping is mapping vulnerable areas before a disaster so that you can then model what the consequences might be in mitigative action. But as I said, they're a tool. They're a great tool, but it's the data that's vital. And I suppose if you talk on a really granular level in terms of frontline response and so on, the challenges of payloads and battery life and so forth. I mean, can you imagine if you could get drones to actually rescue people from climate-related events? That would be quite amazing.
You've mentioned data a couple of times. Now we know that drones can collect a lot of data. What have you seen from crisis response organizations in regard to their efforts to manage that data?
There is so much data out there now that a lot of it is being duplicated. And that's one of the things that I've discussed with people, or people far cleverer than I have been telling me, is there's got to be some way of pooling some of this data so that people aren't going out and constantly reinventing the wheel. Because a lot of the time, especially with mapping, especially with drones and so forth and all the data they provided, that data is going to be immensely useful to another discipline. So how can we share that? Now, obviously, there could be privacy concerns, ethical concerns, and all those sort of things. But we should find a way of sharing that data and making it available, maybe in some great central repository or something. The trouble is, as you said, is the volume of data sometimes that can be overwhelming, can't it? So everyone works in their individual silos because that data is specific to what they're working on at the time. I mean, I'm sure it's solvable. I'm not quite sure how. And it will probably take creative thinking on all sides, won't it? And I suppose the other thing is, data visualization, because that could be a really good tool for public education as well. Once you have all that data, you can show people in a way that actually grips their imagination and puts them in a place where they see how things could affect them. That could be really interesting as well.
What excites you about the future?
I know, obviously, everyone's talking about artificial intelligence. And the one thing that excited me about that was when it was pointed out to me how you can use a drone and train the AI to look for people. But you can also, and this is a bit gruesome, but it's absolutely necessary, and it's back to that human level of identifying body parts, say after an air crash or something like that. It can really save the responders, but it can also help the families of victims and so forth to achieve some sort of closure or know that their loved one has been brought back together. And that's, to be able to have that sort of identification after a mass casualty event is really, really important. And the other thing that I saw that, again, is happening now, so I'll move on to the future in a minute, but is the augmented reality, overlaying onto live video feeds and so forth and seeing landmarks after a bomb or a hurricane or an earthquake or something. That is just immensely powerful tool for emergency responders and can really speed up and help target better response as well. I've spoken to so many experts in drones, and they've all told me, because this is a question I ask them as a journalist, saying, what do you think of the future? And they all say, they've no idea where the future is going to lead to. We're only bounded by our imagination. With the next generation of researchers and engineers and scientists coming through, and minds working together through crowdsourcing and so forth, nobody knows in which real direction it's going to go. I suppose the one area that people don't always traditionally think of as crisis response is the medical and health areas, and especially in inaccessible places. And I mentioned briefly about lab tests and how drones are a tool that are helping reduce HIV in Malawi from mother to child transmission and so forth by speeding up laboratory tests. And that seems to me an absolutely incredible use that could become far, far wider in many countries, especially when we talk about traffic and so forth. So I think that's really important.
And what about the size of drones? Are most crisis response managers opting for the larger commercial drones, or have you seen a move towards the smaller or even the nano-sized drones?
I think at the moment they're going for the large ones and the heavier industrial ones, as you say. But I think they're also moving, and this will be the specialized search and rescue organizations, using nano drones or drones like the Black Hornet or something to get into those hard-to-reach areas, crevices, rubble, glaciers, and so forth. And also into any sort of critical infrastructure that's been damaged and so forth. So I know also that they're looking to be used in they are being used in active shooting scenarios as well, aren't they, in the smaller ones and in hostage negotiations and so forth. And I find that very exciting.
And for my final question, Emily, what message would you like to leave listeners regarding drones and how they support crisis response efforts?
It's incredible how the technology has developed, as I said from the beginning, from something where everyone was so excited to have a drone and they didn't necessarily think about what they could do with that drone, and how that's switched back on itself now. And it's an immense tribute to the technology that it's just become, we have this drone, but actually what we're doing is all these other things, the 3D modeling, the mapping. They've become such an invaluable tool, and they are saving lives. So I think there's some barriers to adoption that need to be overcome. There's also some regulatory and ethical issues to take into consideration. But on the whole, there's such an immense force for good. We should embrace them. The future is so exciting. Let's make sure we do it properly.
That's it for episode 183 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Emily Hough of the Crisis Response Journal. I want to thank Emily for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about the Crisis Response Journal or want to connect with Emily, check out the webpage at crisis-response.com. If you like the Drone Radio Show, please consider supporting the podcast with a small donation. The content is always free, but for as little as $1, you can help defray the cost of production. To donate, go to droneradioshow.com/donate or patreon.com/droneradioshow. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Gores.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.